most of my 5 years preaching here, I haven't got to take naps on Sunday evenings because I usually have more prep work to do for my Sunday night sermon. But these past few weeks, maybe the past 2 weeks, I've been able to take a nap. And today I got 3-4 hours. I mean, it was half of a good night's sleep, and I feel good, but I feel weird. You ever wake up from a nap and just like feel like everything is just a dream, like this doesn't feel real? I'm in one of those kind of hazy feelings right now, but I'll probably be up all night tonight because I got so much sleep. But Sunday naps, they are good stuff. I'm going to give you a series of sentences, really a series of half sentences. And I want you to tell me if this sounds like it's going in a good direction or a bad direction. And you'll see what I mean in just a second. Here's the first one. I love God, but. Does that sound like it's going in a good direction or a bad direction? It doesn't sound very good, does it? What about this one? I love God, however, bad. Yeah, that's bad. Here's another one. I love God, except bad. Yeah. Last one. I love God, nevertheless, bad. Yeah. All of these sound like they're heading in a pretty bad direction, right? Because when it comes to loving God, there should be no exceptions, right? There should be no buts or howevers or neverthelesses. There shouldn't be any of those things. But if we're looking at reality, we all have exceptions that we have to constantly be fighting and constantly be dealing with. We all have things that are fighting for our loyalty and our love and our faith, our allegiance. And that's why I wanted Marshall to read what he read, where Jesus talks about you can't have two masters, because you're going to end up loving one and hating the other, and there's really no other way around it. And so as we look at our lives, I think we can definitely see that temptation presents itself as exceptions many times. You see, I love God, but I really enjoy money, or the making of money, or the spending of money. I love God, but, however, I enjoy my possessions. I love God, except I also really enjoy intimacy with another person, whether that be a person I'm married to or a person I'm not. I love God. Nevertheless, I don't really like sacrificing my time for service or fellowship. I love God, but I've got other things that are fighting for my love as well. The thing is about that phrase, I love God, but it's never the route to faithfulness. That's never the route to go to achieve faithfulness, and it will always lead to a deeper love, a deeper dependence, a deeper involvement in sin. And we need to work to be people who say, I love God, period. I love God, and not allow exceptions to kind of get in there. No exceptions, no howevers, excepts, or buts, or neverthelesses. I love God, therefore I make Him my one and only master. That's what we as Christians, that's something we have to strive for and work for, and it's a constant battle. It's a lifelong battle. What we're going to be looking at tonight is 1 Kings chapter 3, but we're only going to look at the first 3 verses. I'm going to try with this series to take big, long passages and kind of condense them down and pull out a few main points that the text is bringing out. But when I looked at this chapter, these first 3 verses, they have enough. There's enough there to really focus our time on. And so I want to just focus on these first 3 verses. Unfortunately, in our text, we're going to see King Solomon make some exceptions to his love for God. And though his father David, before his death, of course, told him, keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies, according to what is written in the law of Moses. Even though David, before his death, told Solomon, this is what you need to do, Solomon is going to make some exceptions to that instruction. He's going to make some exceptions there. So let's look at the first verse. 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 1. Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, by marrying Pharaoh's daughter. Solomon brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace, the Lord's temple, and the wall surrounding Jerusalem. Why would God's people need, or why would they want an alliance, a peace treaty with Egypt? Why would they want that? Well, you think about it in very common sense political ways, that's a good move. It's a really good move, because to have an alliance with Egypt, to have a peace treaty with Egypt, well, from a political standpoint, that's a good move, because, Egypt's always been powerful. Wasn't terribly long ago when Israel knew that better than anybody, because they were slaves in Egypt. And so when you think about this from a common sense, just from an earthly standpoint, you say, good move, Solomon, good move. Getting an alliance with Egypt, that is a good move. But if we're looking at this from the standpoint of God, if we're looking at this from the standpoint of being God's people, it's not a good move. It's not a move based upon faith. Notice what the law says in Deuteronomy 17, beginning in verse 14. When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your countrymen you shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. If you know the story of Solomon pretty well, you know that everything that was said there, Solomon is going to break. Everything that was listed there, the kings of your, when you get into the land, into the promised land, and you inevitably want a king for yourself. See, God already knew they were going to do this. They already had in their law that they were going to have a king eventually. And when you get a king, he is not to do all these things. And we're going to look at Solomon. We even see a lot of this in David. But when it comes to Solomon, we see all of this get broken. And it even starts right here in our text, where Solomon, he goes to Egypt. That's one place. You don't go back that way. Don't even deal with Egypt. But yet he does. He goes and he creates this alliance with Egypt for this mutual protection between the two nations. And he's going to go on to form many, 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 many other alliances with other nations. And he's going to do that through the same way he did it with Egypt, which is through marriage alliances. He's going to marry the ruler's daughter and form this alliance, which was a very common thing in that day. He's multiplying wives for himself. Not to mention that these were all foreign women whom God also said, don't marry them. Don't intermarry with the foreigners. You skip forward a little bit in 1 Kings and go to chapter 11 and notice what it says here. This is a little bit later. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women, besides Pharaoh's daughter, so that's who we're reading about right now. He marries Pharaoh's daughter. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, he married women from Moab, from Ammon, from Edom, from Sidon, and from among the Hittites. The Lord had clearly instructed the people of Israel, you must not marry them, because they will turn your hearts to their gods. Yet Solomon insisted on loving them anyway. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. And in fact, they did turn his heart away from the Lord. Seems like God knows what he's talking about, right? Don't do this, or it's going to happen, or this certain things are going to happen. We do that, and those certain things happen. In Solomon's old age, they turned his heart to worship the other gods instead of being completely faithful to the Lord his God, as his father David had been. Solomon worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. In this way, Solomon did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He refused to follow the Lord completely, as his father David had done. There's words in there, in this, at least in this translation. Solomon wasn't completely faithful to God, and he wasn't following God completely. Do you recognize the exceptions there? See, Solomon, he had a love for God, he had some faith for God, but it wasn't complete, because he was also making exceptions, letting other things kind of creep their way in. And these exceptions that Solomon is making, they're going to continue to grow, and he's going to continue to make these exceptions. And they're eventually going to lead himself and his entire nation, his entire kingdom, away from God and toward a dark and very depressing future. But the exceptions don't really stop there in our text. Go back to our text in 1 Kings 3, verses 2 and 3. However, the people were sacrificing on the high places, because until that time a temple for the Lord's name had not been built. Solomon loved the Lord by walking in the statutes of his father David, but he also sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. The high places were the places where the former inhabitants of the land would worship their pagan gods. They were often up high, maybe on a hill or on a mountain or a tall building. They would have these high places where they would worship their pagan gods. And since the temple wasn't built yet there in Jerusalem, was it really wrong to use these little places of worship that were already set up? Was it really wrong to use these in worship to the one true God? You see, you think about that and you say, well, if God didn't say anything about it, then go for it. If God never said anything about it, then sure, it's already a place that's set up for worship. Why don't we just use it and worship God? But the thing is, God explicitly said something about it. If we go back again to the law, in Numbers 33, verses 51 and 52 say this: Tell the Israelites, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you must drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you, destroy all their stone images and cast images, and demolish all their high places. There shouldn't be any high places left. They're supposed to be demolished. But keep on reading again in Deuteronomy, in chapter 12 and verse 1. These are the decrees and regulations you must be careful to obey when you live in the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. You must obey them as long as you live. When you drive out the nations that live there, you must destroy all the places where they worship their gods, high on the mountains, up on the hills, and under every green tree. Break down their altars and smash their sacred pillars. Burn their Asherah poles and cut down their carved idols. Completely erase the names of their gods. Do not worship the Lord your God in the way these pagan peoples worship their gods. Rather, you must seek the Lord your God at the place of worship he himself will choose from among all the tribes, the place where his name will be honored. There you will bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, your sacred offerings, your offerings to fulfill a vow, your voluntary offerings, and your offerings of the firstborn animals of your herds and flocks. God will choose where you should worship. He'll make that apparent. Destroy the high places. Get rid of those places where they worship their gods and you worship where God tells you to worship. But then you skip down just a little bit further in verse 13. Be careful not to sacrifice your burnt offerings anywhere you please. Offer them only at the place where the Lord will choose in one of your tribes, and there observe everything I command you. Don't just worship anywhere you please. Don't just worship anywhere that you see as you know what, that looks good to me, let's worship there. They had specific commands under the old law for these types of things. The Israelites were supposed to completely destroy the high places. They weren't just supposed to worship anywhere. They were supposed to completely erase the memory of those foreign gods that were worshipped in those areas. But here Solomon is, along with the rest of Israel, making sacrifices to God on these high places. And apparently, they had not destroyed and demolished these high places. If these places still exist, then apparently they weren't destroyed. And so we see lots of disobedience. And we see lots of things that are coming from that disobedience. And Solomon is leading his nation to do these things that were explicitly commanded against in the law. And if you look at the way the king was supposed to rule, you can read in the law, and it talks about how the king, he is to himself write a copy of the law for himself. Not have the law written for him. He is to write the law for himself, and he is to read it every single day so that these types of things don't happen. So we see lots of exceptions being made. And as we continue through the book of Kings, we'll see exactly where these exceptions are going to lead to. They're going to lead to practicing idolatry through especially syncretism, which is the mixing of many different religions together. As we go through Kings, we're going to see that the people of Israel, the people of Judah, they worship God and all these others. And this is exactly where what Solomon is doing is leading to. But I want to ask the question, was Solomon trying to do these things? Was Solomon, at this point in time, trying to lead Israel into idolatry? Was he trying to lead Israel away from faith in God? I don't think so. I don't think that's what he's doing at all, because we see in our text, in verse 3, Solomon loved God, but. Solomon loved God, but. And that's really all it takes, isn't it? That's all it really takes, is to love God, but. To make those just tiny little exceptions. That's all it takes. And as you speed through time, as you fast forward, you see how those tiny exceptions turn into bigger exceptions and bigger until what was once there is unrecognizable. In our churches today, we're full of people who, like Solomon and like Israel, they place their faith and their hope of salvation in their country, in their country's alliances, in their country's leaders. Our churches are full of people who won't hesitate to publicly declare allegiance to their country, but then we try to make every excuse that we can not to make public allegiance to Jesus. It makes you wonder why Christians in so many places today feel very comfortable talking about things like politics, but we feel so very uncomfortable talking about Jesus. And that's a shame that it's become that. It's a shame how much of an idol politics has become in this country. And the thing is, We can say that we don't worship our country. We can say that we don't worship politics, but when you look at our lives, it's all we watch, it's all we read about, and it's all we talk about. Pretty much sounds like worship. When our lives are completely surrounded and enveloped with this kind of stuff, it's more than just a hobby. It's become more than just something we're interested in. We're giving ourselves over to this, and what it's doing is it's controlling our hopes and our fears, to where we get to the point to where we're like Israel, where our hopes rely on the decisions our leaders are making, and our hopes rely on the next election. Our hopes rely on the alliances that we have with other nations. But what also comes with that is our fears go along with that, where our fears are controlled by our leaders. Our fears are controlled by our alliances with other nations. It's our hope and our fears rely on all of these things. And when that becomes the case, it's no longer God who is our God. Because we're no longer hoping or fearing in Him. We're hoping and fearing in other things. The fact is, it's idolatry. It's idolatry, and it's nothing new, because you go back and you look at all these kingdoms and these empires and these nations that have come up and been in power. The people of Egypt, they were expected to worship Egypt. The people of Babylon, they were expected to worship Babylon. The people of Rome were expected to worship Rome. And America, and its image, its leaders, its military strength, its alliances, these things are worshipped by its people. And it's not surprising. It's not surprising. It shouldn't be surprising to us, because this is what history shows us. It's how it's always been. But it's very discouraging when people like us, when Christians who are supposed to have our faith and our hopes and our fears completely reliant upon God, when we start partaking in this idolatry too. We've got to stop placing our trust, our faith in America, because the fact is God is in control. And unless we start trusting and hoping and fearing in Him, our future, it's going to be just like Israel's, dark and very discouraging. And to take it away from the national alliances and the country and the nation type idolatry, you don't have to be sacrificing to other gods on high places to be committing personal idolatry in your own life either. All it takes is those little exceptions. All it takes is an exception here and there to love God, but also place your trust and your hopes and your fears in your nation, in your money, in your possessions, trusting in money to provide for and to protect you, trusting in money to bring about your joy and your peace, trusting in your money and your possessions in such a way that if you lost these things, you've lost your hope, and there's nothing but fear. When that is the case, we've made an idol. When our trust and our hopes and our fears are based upon our relationships, trusting in another human being to be the source of our protection, trusting in another person to be the source of our joy and our peace. And without their love and without their affection, there's no hope. There's only fear. We've made an idol out of another person, out of a relationship. And one of the biggest ones, I think, is placing our trust and our hopes and our fears in ourselves. Trusting my hope, my fear, and my trust in myself. So that trusting in my own ability to provide for myself and protect myself is where my hopes and my fears reside. That if I'm not taking care of me, then no one else will. And so I am my provider. I am my protector. And without my own successful efforts in providing and protecting myself and bringing joy and peace to myself, without me, I have no hope. And there's only fear left. I've made an idol out of myself. These are all very common forms of idolatry that we all have to fight against in our everyday lives. We've got to learn to trust and hope and fear in God, not money or the lack thereof, not relationships or the lack thereof, not our own abilities or the lack thereof. We've got to trust in God with no exceptions. No exceptions. Putting our faith and our hope and our fear in Him. Trusting Him to be our provider and our protector. Knowing that He is our salvation from all that could ever harm us. And when we place our trust in Him, we're never going to be let down. If I put my trust in my nation, I think we all know we're going to be let down. If we put our trust in our money, we ought to know by now that we're going to be let down. We put our trust in relationships, in others, we're going to be let down. And if we put our trust in ourselves, we're going to be let down. But we can know for a fact that if we put our trust in God, we're never going to be let down. Because He is the only one who always keeps His promises. And when He says He's going to do something for us, He's going to do it. When He says He's our protector and our provider, He is our protector and our provider. And we can't follow after King Solomon to where we trust and hope and find our peace and our comfort in looking to other nations or making exceptions when it pertains to our God. We have to love Him with no exceptions and trust Him with no exceptions. Hope in Him with no exceptions. And so I think that's a good lesson that we can learn from those 3 verses. If you are not a Christian and you'd like to place your faith in Jesus, turning from your sins, saying, I'm not going to be like this anymore. I'm not going to live in sin anymore. I'm going to trust in Him and live for Him. If you want to be baptized into Christ tonight, we'd love to baptize you. If you need to confess something, if you need to repent in some way from a sin that is a constant in your life that you're really struggling with, let us pray for you and encourage you and walk with you. If you have any needs at all, you can let us know. You can see the elders in the back of the room or come forward as we stand and sing.